Ever since it came out in 1985, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood has been a modern classic. It's been incredibly popular and even turned into a TV show on Hulu. It chronicles an America in which a fundamentalist version of Christianity called the Sons of Jacob takes power and transforms America into an authoritarian state. This state brutally oppresses women, and the story follows Offred, a handmaid, or an institutionalized concubine for the ruling class, for the purpose of bearing children. Since the story seems to be set in the 1990s, the near future from when the book was written, it technically counts as alternate history. I'm waiting for all the comments describing that I'm destroying the spirit of the book, which is always supposed to be 5 years in the future, no matter when that year is, but it makes a cool alternate history idea. Also, I need something to make this channel less than 97% male. So what if The Handmaid's Tale really did happen? What would the world be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. God, it feels good sometimes to take a break to recent history, rather than talking about the Hephthalites of the War of Spanish Succession. Before we start, the book was excellent and I highly recommend you read it. The characterization was perfect, the storytelling was strange yet compelling. The writing style perfectly represented the half-insane boredom and fear that the narrator was experiencing. You'll never see the ending coming. The lore wasn't that good, which I feel like this fanbase probably cares a lot about, but on the other hand, the handmaid wouldn't know that much of the outside world, and that's not the point of the book. Also, I understand this book is controversial for some reason, but I think we can agree that we should all treat women well. Any other internet culture wars you want to plaster onto this are your problem, not mine. My speciality is the Crusades, not social justice. Also, as always, I'm only looking at the book and not the TV show for this. The Handmaid's Tale world really starts when the Sons of Jacob seize military power in your standard run-of-the-mill coup d'etat, like the kind we saw in Zimbabwe a few months ago, with them assassinating the president and lead officials of the government, followed by blaming it on Islamic terrorists and installing martial law and suspension of liberties to deal with said falsified threat. On the surface, this sounds highly implausible. Wouldn't the army and confederation of state governments just go about beating the shit out of the Sons of Jacob, wiping them out in a matter of days? This is a perfectly logical explanation, unless you realize the background factors that allowed the Sons of Jacob to rise to power. You see, The Handmaid's Tale is set in a world in which pollution levels get so bad that fertility rates plummet. This results in the return of traditional religions to justify the change in birth rates, and reverse it. Before you judge, remember that biologically, the most important thing before anything else is the need to reproduce. Thus, anything that threatens that will be met by the utmost terror and panic by society. Think of how losing World War I resulted in Hitler or Stalin, and then magnify that. Returning to traditional religion, which is associated with family values and a high birth rate, is a perfectly rational emotional jump for raising a birth rate. So to make this timeline start, we should have the introduction of some chemical byproduct that lowers fertility rates into the American water system in the 1960s or so. I'm not what you would call a chemist, but I'm sure there is some compound that can exist that can do this, and let's say in this timeline it's cleared for industrial use in America. Also, I don't want to get all meta-philosopher on you, but our society is rife for religious backlash. You see, most of history is pretty religious. The times of less religion tend to happen when religions can't keep up with advancing societies or technologies. Then there comes along an era of general lack of religion until the next batch comes along. This has happened several times in history, with the most recent being an era called the Axial Age, stretching roughly from the prophet Elijah to Muhammad, in which all of the world's major religions today came to be. For example, in the West, the Roman Empire was very agnostic, with the old gods being dying state-run religions, but then Christianity came to fill the void. What most people fail to realize is that we are in one of the transition periods now. It's just those religions are called things like communism, Nazism, social justice, or Islamic fundamentalism. Everyone is searching for meaning in a life that describes no clear one. This creates an immense opening for a massive religious backlash. An example from our modern world would be Islamic fundamentalism, or one from the ancient past would be Hinduism, which is a reworked version of the old Indian faith smashed together into an axial age religion against the common thread of Buddhism. Atwood says that a third of America's population would be Gilead supporters by the time of the revolution, which she says the smallest number need to support a totalitarian state. And I agree. This is the number of supporters the Nazis had, and the communists probably had even less before World War I, made everyone pissed at everything in Russia, so I could totally see Gilead coming to power. So when you see the sons of Jacob rebelling, don't see a small clique of insane psychos, but instead a good third of the population, with military, economic support, etc., supporting them. Imagine in this timeline there's simply no united leadership against the sons of Jacob, no central force to rally around, and no one with enough courage to counterbalance the force. This has happened so many times in history I won't even try to list them. A small determined group can easily control all power if there's nothing to stop them. So as said earlier, Atwood is really vague in lore details about the world of The Handmaid's Tale. This isn't really detrimental to the story, since the story is from the point of view of a nobody, but it makes my job a lot harder. We do know that Gilead is in a state of war against other parts of America, however the geographic boundaries of Gilead are unknown, with only a couple details known. We know that Washington, D.C. is part of Gilead and not the frontier, because the commander makes a business trip there. We also know that the Dakotas are part of Gilead, because that's where they put the black reservations. Brief digression, along with being oppressive to women, Gilead is also horrifically racist. They move all of America's blacks to horrific reservations in the Dakotas, like the tribal homelands of apartheid South Africa. They also force all Jews to either convert to Christianity or go to Israel. Who are Gilead's enemies? The only ones that are directly mentioned are the Baptists of Appalachia. We don't know if the entire South is in rebellion, or if this is a couple of guerrillas in West Virginia. However, Gilead is in a total war society, with their entire male social structure devoted to war and their economy on strict rationing and economic collapse. This means that Gilead is likely struggling against some pretty powerful enemies. If the Baptists are the only one described fighting Gilead, it means that the leadership in the struggle has gone mainly to a religious level. This means that the largest denominations would likely be the ones that would be able to resist. Also, Boston is a center of the sons of Jacob. In our timeline, Boston is by far one of the least religious parts of America. This gives my religious vacuum theory some credence. The areas that have no strong central religion, when the religious backlash came, were the ones that took the sons of Jacob strongest. This is probably a pretty good map to guess what the geographic boundaries of Gilead would be. In areas where the largest sects are Catholic, it would probably be controlled by Gilead. That's because the Catholics are the majority practically nowhere in America, with there on average being twice as many Protestants. But the Catholics are able to gain a plurality when there is no central Protestant sect, but lots of little ones. Without the central leadership, the Gilead forces would dominate. This means that obviously the Baptists would be the main resisting force against Gilead. My second choice would be the Lutherans, who control almost the entire northern plains, but apparently Gilead controls the Dakotas, which means this isn't meant to be. The Mormons would likely be able to split off, being the majority in Utah and the surrounding counties, which are surrounded by easily defensible mountains and deserts on all sides. The Methodists could be a group to survive, but the Gilead forces fighting against the Baptists in Appalachia means that the Methodists further north would have already been defeated. Also, the Methodists tend to spread out instead of be concentrated, meaning their disparate areas could be taken down one by one. So this is a probable map of Gilead, with the Mormons and the South being independent. I'm tempted to split California and the West Coast off from Gilead, simply because it's so split off from the rest of the continent by mountains and deserts. But if we're going off the lack of central religion model, California would be one of the staunchest Gilead areas in the country. Ah, the most socially liberal part of America in this timeline is the Bible Belt. Now that's irony. So I'm totally stretching myself more than is healthy here, but who would win this war? The South would probably gain independence and the Mormons maybe. Remember, the South almost won our timeline's Civil War 150 years ago, with the region smaller than this timeline's Baptists. The South is so much better off by almost any metric in comparison to the other states now than it was back then, be it population, economy, industry, military, etc. Real-life lore is a really fascinating video comparing what economy, military, etc. of if the Union Confederacy had to face off today, the link to which is in the description. The North would still have twice the South's population, military budget, and almost 3 times the economy. However, the South almost won with odds much worse than that in our timeline, so they would probably be able to win a war of independence in this timeline, but not be able to liberate the rest of America. The Mormons are in a great geographic spot, surrounded on all sides by great mountains and deserts. Also, the Mormons have probably the greatest sense of cultural unity of anyone in America. I can imagine the Mormons fighting a fanatical guerrilla campaign in the mountains of Utah. On the other hand, they're an area of 3 million fighting a war of independence against Gilead with 160 million, which surrounds them on all sides. This really depends on how screwed up Gilead is. We don't get any real sign of the books on how advanced their military capabilities are, so I can't tell you. I bet my money on Gilead, though. Atwood says Canada is at peace with Gilead, which makes a lot of sense. Canada is 10% of America's population, meaning for survival it must get along with whoever is in power in America. So Canada would keep out of Gilead's affairs as best as it could, no matter how much they detested the regime. If America fell apart in the early 1990s to Gilead, it would be incredibly awkward geopolitically. This was a short window of time between the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, in which the US was the only world power. The collapse of US power would thus result in a chaotic, almost dark age, in which regional powers would try to build themselves up to fill the power void left by the collapsing US. In China, Deng Xiaoping had recently started the process of turning China into a capitalist nation. However, with capitalist America collapsing only years after the Soviet Union, which in turn collapsed when it tried to turn capitalist, the message in China would be that capitalism was a dying philosophy, and that they should turn back to communism. This would result in China having a conservative communist backlash, with it never developing a capitalist economy. In this timeline, China would never modernize and remain a poor and unimportant nation. Japan, meanwhile, would be stuck out in a limb. This was at the start of what the Japanese called the Lost Decade, in which Japan stagnated due to an economic bubble. Japan, a country dependent on the outside world for everything, including food, oil, metals, etc., would need to spread outwards to survive without the Americans to maintain the world order that had given them all these materials. Just think of how getting rid of American food exports would disturb the Japanese food market. The Japanese would remilitarize, subduing countries like the Philippines, Taiwan, and Indonesia into their power zone. In Europe, the US was most of the military force that supported the entire continent. This would be right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the NATO forces spreading into Eastern Europe. Without the Americans to manage the continent, the British and the French would be terrified of the possibility of a united Germany crushing all of them, and so would increase their militaries. This would result in great tension in the EU. Meanwhile, with America collapsing, we would see what has recently happened in Russia happening even earlier, with a Putin-like figure rising to power earlier and trying to reconquer the old Russian Empire earlier as well. The Baptist New Confederacy would be the largest economy on Earth and would be allies with the European nations, but most of its energies would be placed in not getting reconquered by the massive Gilead to the north, meaning it wouldn't be able to fill the void of what US power used to be. In general, this timeline would see a general stagnation of the world. The US is central to the world's political, economic, technological, and military systems. This was in an era in which there was simply nothing to replace it either. Honestly, imagine the fall of Rome, in which the central world system collapsed and was replaced by smaller, more local systems, and everyone struggled to rebuild the collapsed world system. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please subscribe, comment, and stay tuned for future videos. If you liked that video, you might like my take on the Draca, which is an alternate history world in which apartheid South Africa takes over the world and enslaves mankind. Or you might like my book review of The Man in the High Castle, a popular alternate history book in which the Nazis win World War II. And as always, thank you very much for watching.